The president rejecting the proposed temporary cut in rice tariffs, what lies ahead for millions of Filipinos facing high crop prices? Let's get the thoughts of Cielito Habito from the Management Association of the Philippines, live here in the studio. Good evening, Secretary.
Good evening. Good evening, Mai.
Thank you for joining us here. First of all, was the president right in rejecting the said proposal, and ultimately what is the impact on consumers?
Well, actually, we in the Management Association of the Philippines especially are somewhat disappointed that actually the idea of reducing or even cutting the tariffs on rice at this point was meant to support his price cap on rice that he imposed a few weeks ago, because the distortions that price cap caused, or would cause in fact because of the law of supply and demand in the market, would have been alleviated by easier access to imports, and that would let the natural price in the market really go down below that price cap. So without that reduction in tariff, it may be more difficult precisely to enforce that price cap.
Okay. Speaking of the price cap, does this mean that the price cap on regular and well-milled rice will be extended?
Well, we hope that it will not be, precisely because this is the tariff cut was meant to make it unnecessary to have that price cap anymore. So what will happen is that the natural market price will not go down to under the price cap without it. So well, actually the MAP is actually advocating for more general reduction in tariffs, especially on agricultural products in general, not just for the immediate term, but in the longer term, precisely because the overprotection of our agricultural products has made food so expensive in the country. And rice, obviously, is the #1 food that every Filipino practically consumes. And to make that subject to price volatility because of vagaries of supply and demand is not going to be helping the ordinary Filipinos, especially the poor who suffer from a lot of the malnutrition that we're seeing right now.
Okay. But Secretary, the agricultural groups like CNAG, for example, backed the president's decision. What do you make of this?
Well, it's natural for the farmers groups to actually resist importation, no? Because the perceived effect of that is to lower the price at the farm gate, especially for farmers. The problem, however, is that good policy making involves going for the greatest good for the greatest number. And so we're looking at the 110 million Filipino consumers as against about 2 to 3 million rice farmers. And I think the better way to approach the problem that the CNAG and other farmers groups are trying to advocate for is to have more focused, as they call rifle-focused solutions rather than a shotgun approach that would stop imports and therefore make prices higher for everybody else. So this has long been the failure of our government, unfortunately, that the more focused interventions that will really raise productivity and ability of our own farmers to face competition from our neighboring countries, that is really what has long been needed. But we have instead been complacent with just shielding our domestic market from competition from imports. And that's why our domestic prices have gone up continuously over time for the last 30 years. And it is penalizing the greater mass of Filipinos.
Yes, agricultural tariffs have remained high ever since. So, but speaking of solutions, what do you think can the Marcos administration do to lower rice prices as soon as possible, if not the cuts in rice tariffs?
Well, indeed, the rice harvest should be coming soon, within a couple of weeks, I'm told, and that would have a relief on the market itself. No? But at this point in time, it would have really helped to lower the tariff on rice, in fact, even eliminate it, because by rough calculations, one would see that given the world price of rice right now, if you actually have that 35% tariff, nobody will import rice, because the way you could only sell it at much higher than the price cap. So the way to get rice to come in to relieve the shortages that are the result of recent events, including, of course, weather that has not been favorable, all of this could have been mitigated by easier access to imports at the right price. And so this is really what's going to happen right now. We will not ease that pressure.
Well, also among the priorities of President Marcos is food security. But how can we achieve this amid high food prices?
Well, precisely. We cannot have food security when prices are beyond the reach, especially of our poor. In fact, ironically, there are too many people who think that food security simply means we have to produce all the food that we need domestically. But even if we do, and yes, indeed, we can do that, if it's at such a high cost that the poor cannot even afford to buy nutritious food and all they can afford to buy is the rice, because it's already expensive as it is, then what indeed we have is insecurity, food
You're
insecurity
saying
by the poor.
that should translate to affordability and accessibility.
Precisely. That is, availability is just as important as affordability and accessibility. And if prices are too high, which has been the case for as I said, it has grown, it has risen over the last 30 years because of excessive shielding of our domestic market from competition, then indeed we are just making our people food insecure.
Right. Well, going back to tariffs, the Management Association of the Philippines wants the country's tariff structure reviewed and reformed. Could you tell us more about this?
Well, again, because our agricultural products have tended to be subject to very high tariffs. Exceptional, in fact, because since the 1990s, of course, we have already gone through that process of liberalizing trade in the country. But what was left behind was agricultural products, especially the so-called sensitive products, including and especially rice, and there's sugar, and there's corn and fish. And these are the basic commodities that every Filipino needs, especially the poor people need, especially for their protein requirements. So what we need to do is to actually have a situation wherein access to cheaper food overseas is actually eased by not having such high protective walls. However, it has to come, again, with effective programs by the government to help our farmers stand shoulder to shoulder with the farmers that they are competing with overseas. And that is where we have failed. And precisely what has led to that is this artificial situation of shielding imports, so that there was a complacency both in our government, of course, in our producers themselves, because there was no pressure to actually be as productive as the farmers in Thailand or Vietnam.
Yeah, you mentioned Thailand, Vietnam. Filipino families have been burdened with high food prices compared to our ASEAN neighbors and beyond, correct?
In fact, the incidence of stunting and severe malnutrition among children 5 years old and below is the highest in the Philippines among our comparable ASEAN peers, precisely because food has been much more expensive here than elsewhere.
Okay, Secretary, final question. The holidays are fast approaching, but food security concerns are and other economic uncertainties remain. So what's your economic outlook for the rest of 2023?
Well, of course, if you look at all of what the analysts are saying, we really have to expect a slower economy in the remainder of the year. In fact, there have been projections already made by, I think, a UK-based institution that says, oh, we might be seeing a further slowdown in the third quarter. But given that as it may, access to food is still the most basic need that has to be met among our people. And obviously, the Christmas season is when food becomes very prominent in everybody's budgets. And so one hopes that with the harvest coming in and hopefully with the prices improving simply because of hopefully more liberalized importation of these basic commodities, then we can still have a Merry Christmas.
Thank you for your thoughts and thank you for joining us in the studio this evening.
Thank you.
Cielito Habito of the Management Association of the Philippines.